Napoleon Bonaparte, a name that echoes across the world, still revered today as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. But, like many historical myths, the truth behind his rise is as complex as the figure he constructed. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a territory still in dispute between France and Italy, Napoleon seemed destined for something great, even though he came from humble origins. Without the noble blood that accompanied the great monarchs of the time, he was born under a sky filled with ambition. When Napoleon entered the French army, he was no more than a young officer with a dream, the dream of conquering the world. He quickly distinguished himself, not for his noble heritage, but for the strength of his military intellect. With a tight grip over his troops, he was able to win impossible battles, defeat enemies, and reshape the history of a Europe torn by the French Revolution. He seemed invincible. By 1799, after a series of impressive victories, Napoleon seized power in France, declaring himself first consul. But that was just the beginning. In 1804, crowned Emperor of the French, he no longer saw himself as an ordinary man. He was not just Napoleon Bonaparte the man. He became Napoleon Bonaparte, the personification of an empire. The image he projected to the world was that of a divine conqueror, someone who transcended humanity and rose above mortals, ready to establish a new world order. His rise was not only military but also a meticulously orchestrated work of art. Napoleon did not just lead battles, he led with his image. Every move he made, every gesture in public, was a piece of propaganda. He presented himself not only as a ruler but as a symbol of strength, a figure destined to be immortalized. Every victory, every conquest he used as fuel for the myth he was building. The myth that he was unbeatable, immortal, a force of nature, and the people believed it. France believed it. The world believed it. But like all great myths, the truth was never just what was visible on the surface. Napoleon knew that, to secure his hold on power, he needed more than just military victories. He needed to create an immortal empire, not only on the battlefield but in the minds of every person who laid eyes on him. Like a work of art, Napoleon carefully crafted his image with precision. He hired the best artists, writers, and architects to mold his figure into that of a deity. Jacques-Louis David, a renowned painter, was commissioned to create grand portraits, where Napoleon appeared as a Greek hero, immortalized in his most idealized form. The famous painting Napoleon Crossing the Alps was not just a depiction of an event, but propaganda. There he was not a common man but a god, defeating nature and its forces, mounted on a sturdy horse, with a flowing cape and a serene face. This construction extended beyond art. Napoleon made sure that his presence was felt in every aspect of French life. The architecture of Paris was transformed to reflect his power. The Arc de Triomphe, a colossal monument, was erected to celebrate his victories. His speeches were filled with near-mythical eloquence, and he always positioned himself as a leader chosen by fate, the savior of a France emerging from the revolution. In public, he was unwavering. There were no flaws, no mistakes. He saw himself as the embodiment of France, the force that would unify the nation. But the truth lay elsewhere, far from the painted canvases and streets adorned with marble. This public glory was carefully constructed, but like all great lies, it was about to come crashing down. And so, the myth began to grow stronger. France applauded, admired, and above all, feared. Napoleon was no longer just a man. He was an idea that, like all great ideas, would eventually be tested to its limits. While Napoleon ruled with an iron fist and a divine image, the battlefields revealed a very different reality. Napoleon's victories were achieved at a tremendous cost, not just to his enemies, but to his own soldiers. The grandeur of the battles he fought was not only the result of his strategic genius, but also the brutal sacrifice of nameless men who fell like pieces in a macabre game of chess. Napoleon's campaigns, which dominated Europe, were often marked by massacres and atrocities, where human life was reduced to a statistic. In Egypt, for example, his troops were immersed in a foreign land, far from their supply base, with diseases that devastated their ranks. The famous 1812 campaign in Russia, in particular, was one of the greatest disasters in military history. Napoleon lost almost 400,000 men as his troops advanced relentlessly, facing the unforgiving winter and a lack of food. Moreover, Napoleon's constant quest for more power led him to enslave hundreds of thousands of men, forcing them to fight under the promise of glories that would never come. Many of these soldiers were, in fact, prisoners of war or peasants conscripted by force, ill-trained and unprepared to endure the brutal conditions of war. Napoleon's victories often relied on the pain and suffering of these invisible masses, whose lives were nothing more than disposable pieces on the board of his ambition. Meanwhile, the generals and closest advisors to Napoleon were often the only witnesses to the true cost of his campaigns. The empire he was building, invincible, eternal, was supported by a pillar of human suffering. The idea that Napoleon was creating an empire for the glory of France was nothing but a facade. The truth was that his empire was built on the bones of thousands, and the glory he sought was, in reality, stained with the blood of his own soldiers. However, France did not know this, or rather, it chose not to. To the French people, Napoleon remained a hero. The image of the emperor, dressed in his imperial cloak, riding his horse, continued to shine as a beacon of hope and power. But behind the scenes, the empire was rotting, and the victims were not only the enemies he conquered but the men who fought by his side, unaware that their loyalty would lead them to their deaths. Even as his image of grandeur and power shone across the European continent, Napoleon's body was beginning to give way. The emperor who seemed invincible on the battlefield was, in reality, not immune to the limits of mortality. Behind the gleam of the crown and the splendor of the court, Napoleon faced a series of health problems that slowly began to erode his vitality. In the early years of his empire, Napoleon appeared unstoppable, but as time passed, he began to show signs of where his health, which once seemed unbreakable, started to fail him. The stresses of endless campaigns, numerous political assassinations, and the constant pressure to maintain his position of power began to affect his body. Reports of excessive fatigue, unexplained pains, and a growing difficulty to maintain his energy during battles started to surface. But the true tragedy for Napoleon was that he had no patience for treating himself as he should. He was a man obsessed with perfection and victory. His body, to him, was just another tool to be used, just another piece of the empire. He ignored the symptoms and the medical advice, preferring to rely on his iron will, as if that were enough to sustain his health. His personal physician, Dr. Francois Carlo, tried to warn him about his imbalanced diet and extreme stress, but Napoleon dismissed his warnings. Napoleon's fragile health wasn't merely a matter of negligence. The emperor himself came to believe that his health was immune to the laws of nature. He began to view his illness as something irrelevant, something that could not affect the god he believed himself to be. However, this fallacy came at a high price. Slowly, the empire was wearing down not only from its external battles, but from within his own body. Napoleon had built an empire that seemed indestructible, but his own body had begun to turn into a lost battlefield. Napoleon, the man who had dominated Europe with an empire that stretched from Lisbon to Moscow, was forced to watch his greatness crumble, piece by piece. His defeat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813 was the first major blow to the empire. But the end was sealed when he was finally exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. The empire he had built, which seemed invincible, was now in ruins. Exile, however, was not a golden retirement on a paradise island. For Napoleon, Elba was a gilded prison, a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea where the glory he had so desperately sought was replaced with despair. His life in exile was marked by a sense of powerlessness and frustration. He, the great conqueror, now spent his days on a piece of land isolated from everything he once controlled. Each morning, he woke not to the sight of the battlefield, but to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks of an island where he no longer had dominion. But Napoleon's story didn't end there. He managed to escape from Elba in 1815 and returned to France, where, for a brief moment, his glory was revived. Called back by the people, he returned triumphantly, but soon realized that what he had lost was irretrievable. The Battle of Waterloo, on June 18, 1815, was Napoleon's last attempt to reclaim what he had lost. But once again, reality overtook him. The battle was a disaster. Napoleon was defeated, not only by the European coalition but by his own body, already exhausted from decades of war, a weakened health, and an inability to sustain the iron empire he had built. After the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, at the end of his life, he would face not only physical isolation, but also the collapse of his image. The man who had been a legend, an unbeatable force, now found himself alone, at the mercy of time and diseases that could not be fought with weapons or strategies. Napoleon's exile was not merely a political defeat. It was the end of an empire that existed more in the minds of people than in reality. And as he retreated into solitude, the glory he had longed for had already disintegrated, replaced by the agony of a man who had been, for so long, invincible. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died on the isolated island of St. Helena. The man who had ruled much of Europe, the emperor who once believed himself immortal, had a death marked by solitude and a disease no one could defeat. He was over 5,000 kilometers from home, far from the grand streets of Paris, distant from the glory he had once built. His death was not that of a victorious emperor, but of a broken man who spent his last days with deteriorating health, alone and bitter. He did not die on his throne, surrounded by subjects, but in a sickbed, isolated and condemned to silence. The circumstances of his death became fertile ground for mysteries and speculation. At the time of his death, his body had already been severely affected by the diseases that plagued him during his years in exile. He suffered from a range of health problems, but it was gastric cancer, possibly due to a stomach ulcer. That seems to have been the main factor leading to his death. The doctor who attended him on the island, Dr. Barry O'Meara, reported that the emperor was severely weakened, but his death was shrouded in a fog, with conflicting reports and theories about the real causes. Napoleon's death was followed by a swift ceremony, lacking the spectacle that usually surrounded the lives of great emperors. However, how his death was handled by the French and European powers revealed something even more complex. The continuation of the myth. The French, even after his death, continued to idealize Napoleon as a national hero. The French government tried to maintain the image of Napoleon as a great leader who died as a martyr, fighting to the end for his ideals. But the truth was not so simple. In the years that followed, reports began to emerge questioning the image Napoleon had created for himself. Historians began to delve deeper into his death and the mysteries surrounding it. One of these mysteries was the theory that Napoleon might have been poisoned, an idea that gained fame after an analysis of his autopsy revealed traces of arsenic in his hair. The truth about his death was never fully revealed. What is certain is that, even after his death, the myth of Napoleon persisted. His body was returned to France, where he was buried with great honor at the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, becoming a symbol of his eternal glory. The official narrative still claimed that Napoleon died of natural causes, but the question always lingered. Did he really die as an ordinary man, or was his death just a continuation of the grand charade he had built? As with all great myths, the truth is more complex and darker than any official story. Napoleon Bonaparte died as a man, but the myth he created lived on, fueled by the imagination and the need for people to believe that he was something more than human. His death, surrounded by doubts and cover-ups, was the final great lie of an empire that never existed beyond what he wanted people to see. And while monuments in his honor stand tall, it is possible that, somewhere in the world, someone still wonders, who was Napoleon Bonaparte really, and what truths are buried with his body.